The janitor was arrested for child abuse, and nobody questioned it until we found the real predator on staff. Gerald Novak was arrested on a Thursday morning in October while mopping the hallway outside the elementary wing. I was in my classroom preparing for second period when I heard shouting and looked out to see 2 police officers handcuffing him against the wall. Principal Whitmore stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the arrest happen. Gerald didn't resist or argue. He just stood there with his hands behind his back while students passing between classes stopped to stare. By lunch, the entire school knew. The janitor who'd worked at Riverside Middle School for 12 years had been arrested for sexually abusing a student. The accusation came from a 7th grade girl named Madison Brennan who'd reported to the school counselor that Gerald had touched her inappropriately in the supply closet near the gymnasium 3 days earlier. She'd been sent there to get paper towels during PE class, and Gerald had been inside organizing cleaning supplies. According to the police report that circulated among staff by afternoon, Madison described specific details about the encounter that seemed credible and disturbing. The district placed Gerald on immediate leave and banned him from school property. Whitmore sent an email to all families assuring them the situation was being handled with full cooperation from law enforcement. Nobody questioned it. Nobody defended Gerald. The collective response was relief that the predator had been identified and removed before he could hurt more children. I taught 8th grade history and had worked at Riverside for 6 years. Gerald had always been quiet and professional in our interactions. He kept the school clean and responded quickly to maintenance requests. I'd never seen him act inappropriately around students or staff, but I also knew that predators often appeared normal. That was how they operated successfully for years without detection. My instinct was to trust Madison's accusation and be grateful the school had taken swift action. Except something bothered me about the timeline. Madison claimed the abuse happened on Monday afternoon during 4th period PE. I'd been in the hallway that day covering a colleague's hall monitoring duty. The supply closet she mentioned was directly across from where I'd been standing for 30 minutes. I never saw Madison leave the gym, never saw Gerald near that closet. The hallway had been busy with students moving between classes, and I'd been paying attention specifically to monitor behavior. If Madison had gone to that supply closet during PE, I would have noticed. I didn't say anything immediately because I wasn't certain about my memory. Maybe she'd left the gym during a moment I'd been distracted. Maybe I'd been focused on different students and missed her. But the doubt nagged at me through the rest of the week. On Friday, I checked with the PE teacher, Coach Denise Hartwell, and asked if she'd sent any students for supplies on Monday. She looked confused and said no. Her classes that day had been playing basketball and she hadn't needed any extra equipment or supplies. I asked specifically about Madison Brennan. Denise said Madison had participated in the full class period without leaving the gym. She remembered because Madison had twisted her ankle during the game, and Denise had personally walked her to the nurse's office afterward. That meant Madison's story about being sent for paper towels was false. Either she'd confused the day, or she'd fabricated the errand entirely. I thought about going to Whitmore with this information, but hesitated. Madison was 13 years old, reporting abuse. Questioning her credibility felt dangerous and wrong. Maybe she'd gotten the day confused. Trauma could affect memory. The important thing was that she'd reported abuse, and Gerald had been arrested based on evidence I didn't have access to. The police and school administration were handling it properly. My observations about the hallway didn't disprove abuse had occurred. It just meant the specific timeline Madison described didn't match what I'd witnessed. That discrepancy could be explained without invalidating her experience. So I stayed quiet through the weekend and tried to convince myself the system was working correctly. Except I kept thinking about Gerald's face during the arrest. He'd looked confused and defeated. Not guilty or panicked. Just resigned to something he didn't understand. Monday morning, the school counselor, Angela Pierce, called an emergency staff meeting before classes started. She'd been working with Madison and wanted to update us on proper procedures for handling student disclosures. Angela emphasized that we should believe victims when they reported abuse and avoid asking questions that might seem accusatory or skeptical. She said Madison had been very brave coming forward, and we needed to support her through this difficult time. Several teachers nodded in agreement. One asked if there had been other victims, and Angela said the investigation was ongoing, but we should report any concerning behavior we'd observed from Gerald over the years. That invitation to pile on with retroactive suspicions felt wrong to me. Suddenly, teachers were remembering moments that seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared sinister. Gerald had always been friendly with students. He'd joked with them in the hallways, helped them when they dropped things. Normal human interactions were being reinterpreted as grooming behavior because everyone wanted to believe they'd spotted warning signs they'd actually missed. I approached Angela after the meeting and asked to speak privately. We went to her office and I explained what I'd observed on Monday. That I'd been monitoring the hallway where Madison claimed the abuse occurred and hadn't seen her leave the gym. That Coach Hartwell confirmed Madison hadn't left PE class for supplies. Angela listened carefully before saying trauma could cause memory confusion about specific details. The important thing was that Madison had disclosed abuse, and we needed to support her healing rather than scrutinizing her timeline. I said I understood that but felt obligated to mention what I'd witnessed since it contradicted her account. Angela looked uncomfortable and asked if I was suggesting Madison lied. I said I wasn't suggesting anything, just reporting facts about what I'd seen. She thanked me for bringing it forward and said she'd note my observations in her records. Then she reminded me that questioning a child's abuse disclosure could be extremely damaging, and I should be careful about discussing my doubts with other staff. I left Angela's office feeling dismissed and frustrated. My observations were factual. Madison had not left that gym during the time frame she'd described. That didn't mean abuse hadn't occurred at a different time or place. But it meant the specific story she'd told was inaccurate. And if one part was inaccurate, what else might be wrong? I decided to do something I probably shouldn't have. I checked the school security footage from Monday afternoon. Riverside had cameras covering main hallways and entrances, but not inside classrooms or locker rooms. The footage required administrative access, but I'd helped set up the system 2 years ago and still had the login credentials. I pulled up Monday afternoon and watched the hallway outside the gymnasium from 3rd period through 5th. The supply closet Madison mentioned was visible in the frame. Gerald appeared briefly around 3 o'clock, pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. He stopped at the closet, went inside for maybe 5 minutes, then continued down the hall. Madison never appeared. The gym doors opened several times with students coming and going during class transitions, but Madison wasn't among them. She remained inside the gymnasium for the full period exactly as Coach Hartwell had described. The security footage proved Madison's story was false. She hadn't been sent for paper towels, hadn't gone to that supply closet during PE, hadn't encountered Gerald in the way she'd described. The abuse she reported hadn't happened when and where she'd claimed. That revelation should have led to immediate reevaluation of the charges against Gerald. But I was a middle school history teacher with security footage I'd accessed without authorization. Taking this to Whitmore meant admitting I'd been investigating on my own and questioning a child's abuse disclosure. It could cost me my job. It would certainly damage my reputation. Teachers who defended accused abusers were viewed with suspicion even when the accusations proved false. The safe choice was to delete the footage and stay quiet. Let the legal system handle Gerald's case. Trust that truth would emerge through proper channels. Except, I couldn't do that because an innocent man was sitting in jail facing charges that would destroy his life, and I had evidence proving the accusation was fabricated. I made an appointment with Whitmore for that afternoon and brought a USB drive with the security footage. He was irritated that I'd accessed the cameras without permission, but agreed to watch the video. We sat in his office viewing Monday's hallway footage while I explained my timeline observations. Whitmore watched without commenting until the video ended. Then he said the footage showed Gerald had been near the supply closet around the time Madison described. I pointed out that Madison never appeared in the hallway, that she'd remained in the gym the entire period. Whitmore said maybe the abuse happened on a different day and Madison confused the date. I said Coach Hartwell confirmed no students had been sent for supplies all week. Whitmore got defensive and asked why I was investigating this instead of trusting law enforcement. I said I was reporting exculpatory evidence that contradicted the accusation. He said one inconsistency about timing didn't prove Gerald was innocent. I said it proved Madison's specific account was false and warranted further investigation before destroying a man's life. Whitmore ended the meeting by saying he'd forward my observations to the police and district administrators. He made it clear he found my involvement inappropriate and suggested I focus on teaching rather than playing detective. I left his office knowing nothing would change. The system had already decided Gerald was guilty. A 13-year-old girl had made an accusation, and institutional momentum was moving toward conviction regardless of contradictory evidence. Questioning her story made me the villain, even though I was presenting facts. I thought about going directly to the police, but didn't know how to navigate that without seeming defensive of an accused child abuser. I thought about contacting Gerald's attorney, but had no way to reach them. I was stuck with information that should matter, but that nobody wanted to hear. That evening, I got a call from another teacher at Riverside. Her name was Lorraine Voss, and she taught 6th grade English. She'd heard through staff gossip that I'd questioned Madison's timeline and wanted to talk. We met at a coffee shop away from school where she told me something that made my stomach drop. Lorraine had overheard a conversation between Madison and 2 other girls in the library 3 weeks before the accusation. They'd been talking about a television show that featured a storyline about false accusations, and one of the girls had said it would be easy to get someone fired by claiming they'd touched you. Madison had laughed and said the janitor was creepy and nobody would defend him. Lorraine hadn't thought much of it at the time. Middle school girls said provocative things for attention constantly, but after the arrest, she remembered that conversation and it bothered her. Combined with my timeline observations, it suggested Madison might have fabricated the accusation deliberately. Lorraine said she hadn't reported what she'd overheard because it would make her seem unsupportive of an abuse victim, and she couldn't risk that professional stigma. I asked Lorraine why she was telling me now. She said because somebody needed to speak up, and she was too afraid to do it alone. If we both came forward with our observations, maybe administration would listen. I said I'd already tried with Whitmore and been shut down. Lorraine said maybe we needed to go higher, contact the school board or the superintendent. I said that would definitely cost us our jobs. Teachers who challenged abuse accusations became unemployable in education. She knew that. We sat in silence for a while before agreeing we couldn't let an innocent man go to prison because we were afraid of professional consequences. The ethical obligation outweighed our career concerns. We decided to compile everything we knew and present it to Gerald's defense attorney. Let them decide how to use the information. Lorraine had a connection through a friend and got the attorney's contact information. Gerald's attorney was a public defender named Keith Ramos. We met at his office downtown on Wednesday evening and laid out everything. The security footage showing Madison never left the gym. Coach Hartwell's confirmation that no supplies were requested. My hallway monitoring observations. Lorraine's account of the library conversation. Keith listened carefully and took detailed notes. When we finished, he said this information was extremely valuable but presented complications. Introducing evidence that Madison had fabricated the accusation would require putting a 13-year-old girl on trial, essentially. The defense strategy had to be careful not to appear as attacking a child, but the security footage was objective proof that her specific account was impossible. Combined with the overheard conversation about false accusations, it established reasonable doubt at minimum. Keith said he'd been struggling with Gerald's case because his client maintained absolute innocence, but had no alibi or evidence to counter Madison's detailed testimony. Now he had something to work with. He asked if we'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial. Lorraine and I exchanged glances before agreeing. This would become public and ugly, but it was necessary. Keith filed a motion to dismiss based on the security footage and timeline inconsistencies. The prosecutor's office responded aggressively, arguing that minor discrepancies in a victim's account didn't invalidate the core accusation. They produced a psychologist's report stating that trauma victims often confused specific details about timing and location. The judge scheduled a hearing to review the evidence. Keith subpoenaed the school's complete security footage and Madison's counseling records. Angela Pierce fought the subpoena, claiming confidentiality, but was overruled. The case that had seemed straightforward was becoming contested. Local media picked up the story and ran articles about a janitor fighting child abuse charges, using technical arguments about camera footage. Public opinion was predictably hostile toward Gerald. Several parents organized protests demanding his conviction. I received angry emails from colleagues accusing me of enabling an abuser. Lorraine was called into Whitmore's office and told her contract might not be renewed. The professional consequences we'd feared were materializing exactly as expected. The preliminary hearing took place in January, 3 months after Gerald's arrest. I testified about my hallway observations and the security footage. The prosecutor tried to discredit me by suggesting I'd been distracted or misremembering. But the video evidence was irrefutable. Madison had not left that gymnasium during the time she'd claimed to be in the supply closet with Gerald. Coach Hartwell testified confirming Madison had been in class the full period. Lorraine testified about the library conversation she'd overheard. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, claiming the testimony was hearsay and prejudicial. The judge allowed it as evidence of Madison's state of mind. Then Keith played his strongest card. He'd subpoenaed Madison's text messages through discovery and found something damaging. A conversation between Madison and a friend, where Madison joked about getting the janitor fired and how nobody would believe him over her. The texts were dated 2 weeks before the accusation. The prosecutor looked blindsided. Either Madison's counseling records hadn't included this information, or Angela had failed to discover it. The judge reviewed the text messages carefully before calling for a recess. When court resumed, he said the evidence presented serious questions about the accusation's validity. The security footage definitively proved Madison's account of the supply closet encounter was false. The overheard library conversation and text messages suggested premeditation of a false accusation. While trauma could cause memory confusion, this pattern indicated deliberate fabrication rather than honest misrecollection. The judge dismissed the charges against Gerald without prejudice, meaning they could theoretically be refiled if new evidence emerged, but stated clearly he found the current accusation lacked credibility. Gerald walked out of that courtroom a free man. The families who'd organized protests against him were silent. The media coverage shifted from condemning an abuser to questioning how a false accusation had gotten this far. Whitmore released a statement saying the school district had acted appropriately based on information available at the time. Nobody apologized to Gerald for the 3 months he'd spent in jail, losing his job, his reputation, and his savings on legal fees. I expected that to be the end of it. Gerald was exonerated, and Madison's credibility was destroyed. The system had failed, but eventually corrected itself through the adversarial legal process. Except something still bothered me. Why had Madison made this accusation? 13-year-old girls didn't typically fabricate sexual abuse claims against janitors for no reason. The text messages suggested premeditation, but didn't explain motivation. I'd assumed it was attention-seeking, or some adolescent impulse I couldn't understand. But sitting in that courtroom watching Madison testify, I'd noticed something odd. She'd seemed genuinely distressed during her testimony. Not performative distress, but real fear and anxiety. When the prosecutor had asked her to describe the supply closet encounter, she'd provided details that were specific and visceral. Details that sounded like describing a real experience, even though the security footage proved it hadn't happened where she'd claimed. That inconsistency gnawed at me. What if Madison had experienced abuse, but identified the wrong perpetrator? What if something had happened to her and she'd misattributed it to Gerald because he was an easy target? I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention to Madison during school, watching how she interacted with staff and students, looking for signs of distress or unusual behavior patterns. What I noticed was subtle but consistent. She avoided certain areas of the school. She tensed visibly when particular staff members approached her. She'd developed a habit of keeping her back to walls and hallways and never being alone in empty spaces. These were trauma responses. Madison was afraid of something or someone. The question was who. I made a list of staff members whose presence seemed to trigger Madison's anxiety. There were 3. One was Vice Principal Lawrence Grayson, who handled discipline matters. One was Mr. Stephen Kellen, who taught 7th grade science. One was Coach Philip Warwick, who ran the after-school athletic programs. I didn't know any of them well personally. Grayson had a reputation for being strict but fair. Kellen was popular with students and known for making science engaging. Warwick was beloved for building championship sports teams and organizing summer camps. I needed to understand why Madison had falsely accused Gerald specifically. What made him the chosen target instead of the actual person who'd hurt her? I got my answer by accident on a Friday afternoon in February. I was leaving school late after grading papers and passed the administrative offices. Whitmore's door was partially open, and I overheard him on the phone with someone discussing the Gerald situation. He said the district was lucky the case hadn't gone to trial because discovery would have been damaging. Then he said something that made me stop walking. He said they'd been concerned Madison might redirect her accusations towards someone whose conviction would create real problems for the school. The janitor was the safe deflection. Better to sacrifice him than risk exposing someone who mattered. I stood frozen in the hallway processing what I'd just heard. Whitmore knew or suspected Madison had been abused by someone other than Gerald, and he'd allowed Gerald to be arrested rather than investigating who the real perpetrator was. The district had used Gerald as a scapegoat to protect someone more valuable to the school. I knocked on Whitmore's door, interrupting his call. He looked startled when I walked in and asked what he'd meant about Madison redirecting her accusations. Whitmore told me to leave his office. I said I'd overheard him admit the district knew Gerald was innocent, but allowed his arrest anyway. He said I was misinterpreting a private conversation. I said I was calling the police and reporting what I'd heard. Whitmore's expression shifted from angry to calculating. He closed his office door and said I needed to be very careful about what I did next, that there were things I didn't understand about how schools operated, that protecting one employee sometimes meant making difficult choices about others. I asked who they were protecting, who had actually abused Madison. Whitmore said he didn't know for certain and didn't want to know. Plausible deniability was important, but he'd been advised by the district's attorneys to let the Gerald situation resolve itself rather than pursuing investigations that might expose liability. I left Whitmore's office and went straight to my car, called Keith Ramos, and told him what I'd overheard. He said if Whitmore had knowingly allowed false charges against Gerald to proceed, that was criminal conspiracy and obstruction. If the district knew or suspected another staff member was abusing students and failed to investigate, that was criminal negligence at minimum. We needed to document everything and go to law enforcement immediately. Not local police who might have relationships with the school district, but state authorities or the FBI, since this involved institutional cover-up of child abuse. Keith said he'd been suspicious about the case from the beginning. Gerald's prosecution had moved unusually fast. Usually these cases involved extensive investigation before charges were filed. Gerald had been arrested within 3 days of Madison's accusation, with minimal corroborating evidence. That speed suggested either complete certainty or deliberate rush to close the case before complications emerged. Keith contacted the state attorney general's office, which had jurisdiction over public corruption and institutional misconduct. They assigned investigators who interviewed me about what I'd overheard from Whitmore. They interviewed Lorraine about the library conversation and text messages. They interviewed Coach Hartwell and Angela Pierce. Angela initially refused to cooperate, claiming confidentiality, but was threatened with obstruction charges. She eventually disclosed that Madison had originally named a different person during her first counseling session, but Angela had reported it to Whitmore, who'd told her that particular accusation would be very difficult to prove and suggested Madison might be confused about who'd hurt her. Angela had then guided Madison toward identifying Gerald as the perpetrator during subsequent sessions. The investigators asked who Madison had originally named. Angela said Vice Principal Lawrence Grayson, the man responsible for student discipline and safety, the second highest authority in the school. The revelation that Grayson was the actual predator and that Whitmore and Angela had deliberately redirected Madison's accusation toward Gerald triggered a criminal investigation that engulfed the entire school district. Investigators interviewed all students who'd interacted with Grayson over his 8 years at Riverside. They found 4 other girls who described inappropriate behavior and contact. None had reported it because Grayson had convinced them nobody would believe students over a vice principal. He'd selected victims carefully based on who seemed vulnerable or unlikely to be believed. Madison had been targeted because her family situation was unstable. Her father was absent, and her mother worked multiple jobs. She had discipline problems and a reputation as a difficult student. Perfect victim for someone who understood how to exploit power dynamics and institutional credibility. When Madison finally broke down and told Angela what had been happening, Angela had faced a choice: report it and trigger investigation of a vice principal, which would be messy and complicated, or guide her toward accusing someone expendable. Angela had chosen institutional protection over child safety. Grayson was arrested in March. He maintained innocence initially, but physical evidence from his office and vehicle corroborated the abuse allegations. Whitmore was charged with conspiracy and obstruction for his role in covering up the accusations and allowing false charges against Gerald. Angela lost her counseling license for manipulating a victim and violating ethical obligations. The school board fired all three and initiated a complete review of how abuse reports were handled district-wide. Riverside Middle School became a case study in institutional failure to protect students. State investigators found that Grayson had been reported for concerning behavior at 2 previous schools before being hired at Riverside, but those reports hadn't been properly documented or investigated. He'd been allowed to move between schools, building a pattern of abuse because administrators prioritized avoiding scandal over student safety. The systemic rot extended beyond just Whitmore and Angela. It was built into how schools protected their reputations over everything else. Madison and the other victims testified at Grayson's trial. Madison explained that she'd accused Gerald because Angela had convinced her nobody would believe her accusations against a vice principal, but everyone would believe her about the janitor. She'd been manipulated into directing her trauma toward an innocent person by the adults supposed to protect her. The real predator had remained in position, continuing to abuse students for months after Madison first reported him. Grayson was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 23 years. Whitmore took a plea deal for obstruction and got 4 years. Angela was convicted of child endangerment and conspiracy, serving 18 months. The civil lawsuits against the district resulted in millions in settlements for victims and reforms to reporting procedures. Gerald sued the district and received a substantial settlement along with a public apology that acknowledged how thoroughly they'd failed him. I testified at all 3 trials, explaining how I'd stumbled onto the truth through basic fact-checking that administrators should have done immediately. How the rush to conviction of Gerald had been driven by institutional self-protection rather than justice. The prosecutor in Gerald's case was investigated for his aggressive pursuit of charges, despite obvious evidentiary problems, and received professional sanctions, but kept his job. Lorraine Voss became an advocate for mandatory reporting reform and training requirements for school counselors. Gerald never returned to work in schools. The trauma of his arrest and the 3 months in jail had destroyed his ability to trust institutions or feel safe in those environments. He moved to a different state and got work in private sector maintenance. We stayed in touch occasionally. He told me once that the worst part wasn't the jail time or the charges, it was watching everyone so easily believe he was capable of hurting children. How quickly colleagues who'd known him for years accepted his guilt based solely on an accusation. How little his 12 years of reliable service and character mattered when weighed against institutional expedience. 2 years after Grayson's conviction, I left teaching. The experience had shown me that schools were less interested in protecting children than protecting themselves, and I couldn't participate in that system anymore. Madison graduated 8th grade and went to a different high school where she received proper trauma counseling. She wrote me a letter once apologizing for the damage her false accusation had caused. I wrote back that she'd been a victim twice. First of Grayson and then of the adults who'd manipulated her trauma to serve their own purposes. The real villains weren't confused 13-year-old girls. They were the principals and counselors and district administrators who chose institutional reputation over truth. Gerald's exoneration mattered. But what mattered more was ensuring the system that had sacrificed him was exposed and dismantled. Justice came late and incomplete, but it came. Grayson died in prison from a fight with another inmate 3 years into his sentence. Whitmore finished his term and lives quietly under professional disgrace. Angela works retail now, her counseling career permanently ended. And somewhere Gerald mops floors in an office building, carrying the weight of everyone's willingness to believe the worst about someone who'd spent his life doing invisible work that kept their institutions functioning. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.